What if everything you were ever taught about your own existence was a comfortable lie, carefully constructed not to enlighten you, but to keep you still? You have spent your entire life believing that you are here for a reason, that somewhere, in a grand design woven into the fabric of reality, your presence matters. That God looked upon the void and chose to place you in it, not by accident, not out of indifference, but out of love, out of purpose, out of some divine intention that elevates your life above mere chance. This is the story you inherited. This is the story that billions of people carry with them every single day, from birth to death, never once stopping to ask whether it is true. But what if it is not true? What if the reason you exist is not what you think it is? What if the truth behind your creation is not comforting at all, but horrifying? Not horrifying in the way a nightmare is horrifying. Horrifying in the way that silence is horrifying when you suddenly realize no one is coming to answer you. Horrifying in the way that clarity is horrifying when it strips away everything you once believed and leaves you standing alone with nothing but the raw, unfiltered logic of existence. This is not a story designed to frighten you. It is a story designed to wake you up. My name is not important. What is important is that over 300 years ago, a man named Baruch Spinoza, a philosopher who was expelled from his own community, rejected by almost every intellectual circle of his time, and called one of the most dangerous thinkers who ever lived, looked directly into the nature of God, into the nature of existence, and into the nature of human beings, and saw something that most people to this day refuse to see. He did not discover it through prayer. He did not receive it through revelation. He did not find it written in scripture or whispered to him by angels. He found it through reason, through logic, through the slow, patient, relentless process of asking questions that no one else was brave enough to ask, and following the answers wherever they led, no matter how uncomfortable they became. What Spinoza saw was this: that God did not create human beings out of love. God did not create human beings out of compassion. God did not create human beings because we are special, because we are chosen, because we carry some sacred spark that separates us from the rest of the universe. God created human beings because God could not do otherwise. And that single idea, that terrifyingly simple idea, changes everything. But before you can understand why that idea is so devastating, you need to understand what most people actually believe about creation, and why those beliefs feel so natural, so obvious, so undeniable, even when they are built on nothing more than assumption. Think about what you were told. Think about the version of creation that lives inside you, the one so deeply embedded that you may never have questioned it. You were told that God is a being of infinite power and infinite will, that before you existed there was a decision, a choice. God looked at the emptiness and decided, freely, deliberately, out of his own sovereign will, to make something. And out of all the possible things that could have been made, he chose to make you. To make human beings, to make creatures capable of thought, of feeling, of loving him back. This is the story of a personal God, a God who cares, a God who acts out of desire, out of intention, out of a relationship with his own creation. And within this story, human beings occupy a privileged position. We are not just part of the universe, we are the reason for it. Or at least, we are the central reason. The stars, the planets, the oceans, all of it was a stage, built for us, arranged so that we might exist and glorify the one who made us. It is a beautiful story. There is no denying that. It gives life meaning. It gives suffering a purpose. It gives death a transition rather than an ending. It wraps the chaos of existence in a narrative that feels ordered, intentional, and warm. But beauty is not the same as truth. And here is where you need to sit with a question that most people never allow themselves to truly ask. How do you actually know that any of this is real? Not how were you taught it. Not how does it make you feel. Not how many generations before you believed it. The question is simpler and far more dangerous than all of those. What is the actual evidence? If you strip away the authority of tradition, the comfort of community, the fear of what happens if you stop believing, if you remove all of that and stand alone in front of the question, you are left with something deeply unsettling. You are left with the realization that most of what you believe about God and about your own creation is not based on proof. It is based on faith. And faith, by its very nature, is the willingness to believe something without proof. That is not a criticism. That is simply a definition. Faith is what fills the space where evidence cannot reach. And for most of human history, faith has been enough. It has been more than enough. It has been everything. But Spinoza did not stop at faith. Spinoza asked what would happen if you replaced faith with reason. What would happen if you took the same questions? Who is God? Why do we exist? What is the nature of creation? And instead of answering them with scripture or tradition or gut feeling, you answered them with logic. The answer he arrived at is not the answer most people want to hear. To understand Spinoza's conclusion, you first need to understand his starting point. And his starting point is radically different from the one most people use. Most people begin with God as a being, a personal, conscious, intentional being who exists separately from the universe and who chose to create it. This is the God of Genesis. This is the God who speaks, who commands, who loves and punishes. This is a God who has desires, who has plans, who makes decisions the way you and I make decisions. Spinoza looked at this idea and saw a fundamental contradiction. If God is truly infinite, if God possesses infinite power, infinite knowledge, and infinite existence, then God cannot have desires, because desire implies lack. When you desire something, it is because you do not already have it. You want something because something is missing from your current state. But if God is infinite, nothing is missing. There is no gap to fill. There is no absence to correct. An infinite being, by the very logic of what infinity means, cannot want anything, because wanting requires incompleteness, and incompleteness is the opposite of infinity. This is not a minor philosophical technicality. This is the foundation of everything Spinoza built. If God cannot desire, then God cannot have chosen to create human beings out of love or compassion or any personal intention, because all of those things, love, compassion, intention, require desire. They require a being who feels something, who wants something, who is moved to action by an internal state. An infinite God, as Spinoza understood it, does not have internal states. God does not feel. God does not want. God does not decide. And yet, here is where it becomes deeply unsettling. The universe exists. You exist. Something happened. Creation, in some form, is real. So if God did not choose to create, if God did not decide out of love or intention or any act of will, then how did creation happen? Spinoza's answer is one of the most radical ideas in the entire history of philosophy. Creation did not happen because God decided to make it happen. Creation happened because it was necessary, because it could not have been otherwise, because the nature of God, the very essence of what God is, made creation inevitable. Not chosen, not willed, inevitable. God did not create the universe the way an architect designs a building, by looking at a blank space and deciding what to put there. God created the universe the way a fire produces heat, not through choice, not through intention, through necessity. Because that is what fire does, it produces heat. It cannot do otherwise. And God, by the same logic, produces existence. It cannot do otherwise. This is what Spinoza called the metaphysical necessity of creation. And it is the single idea that reshapes everything you think you know about why you are here. But let us slow down, because the implications of this idea take time to absorb, and most people, when they first encounter it, either dismiss it immediately or misunderstand it entirely. The most common reaction is this: if God had no choice in creating us, then God is not really God. God is just a mechanism, a process, a force of nature with no personality, no consciousness, no relationship to the things it produces. This reaction feels logical, but it is based on an assumption that Spinoza would challenge directly. The assumption that being personal, being conscious, being intentional is the highest form of existence. The assumption that a God who chooses is more godlike than a God who simply is. Spinoza would ask you to reverse that assumption entirely. Consider, which is more powerful? A being who has to think about whether to act, or a being whose very nature makes action unavoidable? Which is more absolute, a God who might have chosen differently, or a God whose creation flows from his essence with the same certainty that 3 + 2 = 5? A God who chooses is a God with limitations. A God who chooses is a God who could have done something else, which means there are possibilities that God did not select, options that were available but rejected. That is not infinity. That is a being with a menu of options, picking one. That is not the most powerful thing you can conceive of. That is actually a deeply limited thing, a being constrained by its own decision-making process. Spinoza's God is not limited. Spinoza's God does not pick from options. Spinoza's God is the totality of everything that is, everything that was, and everything that will ever be. And from that totality, existence simply follows, not as a product of will, but as a logical consequence of what God is. This is why Spinoza referred to God and nature as the same thing, not because he was dismissing God, but because he believed that nature, in its full and infinite scope, is God. God is not separate from the universe looking down at it. God is the universe. The entirety of reality, every particle, every force, every living thing, every thought, every moment, is God expressing what God necessarily is, and human beings are part of that expression, not a special part, not a chosen part, not a part that was singled out for a unique purpose, simply a part, a mode, as Spinoza called it, a specific configuration within an infinite system that could not have been otherwise. And here is where the horrifying truth begins to take shape. If human beings are not chosen, if we are not the result of a deliberate act of love or intention, then the entire framework through which most people understand their own existence collapses. Think about what that framework contains. It contains the belief that your life has inherent meaning, that there is a reason you were born, a purpose you are meant to fulfill, a plan that your existence serves. It contains the belief that suffering is not random but instructive, that when you are in pain, it is because God is teaching you something, testing you, or shaping you into something better. It contains the belief that death is not an ending, but a transition, that somewhere beyond this life your soul continues, and that what you do here determines where you go next. All of these beliefs depend on one foundational assumption: that God cared enough to make you on purpose, that there was thought behind your existence, that someone somewhere looked at the possibility of you and said yes. Spinoza's philosophy removes that assumption entirely. If your existence is not the product of choice but of necessity, if you are here not because God wanted you but because the nature of reality made you inevitable, then meaning, as you have always understood it, does not come from outside. It does not come from God. It does not come from a plan or a purpose written into the stars before you were born. Meaning, if it exists at all, comes from you, from your own mind, from the way you choose to interpret your place in a universe that did not specifically intend for you to be in it. That is not a comfortable conclusion. For most people, it feels cold, it feels empty. It feels like the universe has just told you that you do not matter, that you are an accident wrapped in flesh, a brief flicker in an infinite process that will continue long after you are gone. But Spinoza would push back on that interpretation. And here is why. The fact that your existence is necessary rather than chosen does not make it less real. It does not make it less significant within the scope of your own experience. It simply changes where that significance comes from. Consider a river. A river does not choose to flow, it flows because of gravity, because of the shape of the land, because of the accumulation of water over time. No one designed the river with intention. No one looked at the landscape and said, "I will put a river here because I love rivers." The river exists because it had to exist given the conditions that produced it. Does that make the river less beautiful? Does that make the fish that live in it less alive? Does that make the ecosystem it sustains less real? The river is not diminished by the fact that no one chose it. It is simply what it is, a natural consequence of forces larger than itself. And within that river, life happens. Complex, intricate, meaningful life, not because someone designed it to be meaningful, but because that is what life does when it exists. Spinoza saw human beings the same way. We are not accidents in the dismissive sense that word usually carries. We are necessary consequences. We are what had to happen given the nature of God, given the totality of reality expressing itself through every possible configuration. And we are no less real, no less conscious, no less capable of understanding and experiencing existence because of that. In fact, Spinoza believed that understanding this, truly grasping that your existence is not a gift bestowed by a loving hand, but an inevitability flowing from the deepest nature of reality, is itself the highest form of freedom a human being can achieve. But why does this feel so horrifying then? If it is freedom, why does it feel like loss? Because it requires you to let go of something you have clung to your entire life. It requires you to release the story that made you feel safe. The story that said you are important. The story that said someone is watching over you. The story that said your pain has a reason and your death has a destination. Spinoza understood that this release is not easy. He wrote extensively about human nature, about how deeply we're attached to beliefs that comfort us, even when those beliefs are built on nothing solid. He called this attachment a form of bondage. Not because the beliefs are harmful in some simple, obvious way, but because they prevent us from seeing reality as it actually is. And seeing reality as it actually is, that for Spinoza was the only true form of freedom. He did not mean freedom in the political sense. He did not mean the ability to do whatever you want or go wherever you choose. He meant something far deeper, the freedom that comes from understanding. The freedom that comes from no longer being controlled by fears you cannot name, by beliefs you have never examined, by emotions that arise from ignorance rather than knowledge. Most people live their entire lives in a state of what Spinoza called affect, emotional reactions driven by things they do not understand. They fear death because they do not understand what death is. They fear God because they do not understand what God is. They cling to meaning because they do not understand where meaning actually comes from. And all of these fears and attachments shape their behavior, their choices, their relationships, without them ever realizing it. Spinoza believed that the antidote to this bondage was not faith. It was not prayer. It was not surrender to a divine will. The antidote was knowledge. Specifically, it was what he called adequate ideas. A clear, rational, logical understanding of things as they truly are, rather than as they appear to be or as tradition tells you they should be. And the most important thing to understand, the idea that unlocks everything else, is the nature of God and the nature of your relationship to God. Here is what Spinoza saw when he looked at that relationship honestly. You are not separate from God. You have never been separate from God. The idea that God is up there and you are down here, that there is a distance between creator and creation, a gap that can only be bridged by faith or obedience or prayer, that idea is, in Spinoza's framework, a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. God is not a being who made you. God is the process in which you are participating. You are not a creation looking up at your creator. You are an expression of the same infinite reality that you call God. Your thoughts are God thinking. Your awareness is God being aware. Your existence is God existing, in this particular form, at this particular moment, through this particular configuration of matter and energy and consciousness. This sounds abstract. It sounds like philosophy for philosophy's sake, but follow it through to its conclusion, and it becomes deeply personal and deeply unsettling. If you are God expressing itself, then God did not create you out of love, because love implies a relationship between two separate beings. You and God are not two separate beings. You are one. The love you were taught to seek from God is not something that comes from outside you. It is something that happens when you understand what you actually are. And if you are God expressing itself, then the purpose you were taught to find, the mission, the plan, the reason for your existence, does not come from a divine blueprint handed down from above. It comes from the nature of what you are. From the fact that you are a conscious part of an infinite whole, capable of understanding that whole in a way that rocks and rivers and stars cannot. This is what Spinoza meant when he talked about the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis in his Latin. It was not a romantic or devotional love. It was the love that arises naturally when a finite mind begins to comprehend the infinite reality it is part of. It was the joy, and he did call it joy, that comes from seeing clearly, from understanding deeply, from recognizing that you are not an outsider looking at the universe, but the universe looking at itself. But none of this erases the horror. In fact, it sharpens it. Because if God did not choose to create you, if your existence is not a gift but a necessity, then everything you believed about your special status in the cosmos was wrong. Every prayer you ever said to a God who was listening was directed at something that does not listen in the way you imagined. Every moment you spent believing that your life had a cosmic purpose assigned to it by a caring hand was a moment spent believing something that Spinoza, through pure reason, demonstrated to be false. And that is not a small thing to lose. That is everything. It is the loss of the parent who watches over you. It is the loss of the teacher who has a lesson prepared. It is the loss of the judge who will weigh your deeds at the end. It is the loss of the story that made suffering bearable and death survivable. Spinoza did not pretend this loss was painless. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that human beings are creatures of habit and emotion, and that letting go of deeply held beliefs is one of the most difficult things a conscious mind can do. But he also believed, and argued with extraordinary logical precision, that the loss was necessary. Not because the old beliefs were evil or harmful in some obvious way, but because they were false. And living inside a false belief, no matter how comforting, is a form of prison. The prison is invisible. You cannot see the walls because you have never been outside them. The beliefs feel like freedom because they feel like certainty. They feel like solid ground because you have never stood on anything else, but they are not freedom. They are the absence of understanding. And as long as you remain inside them, you cannot see reality as it is, which means you cannot truly know yourself, cannot truly know the world, and cannot experience the one thing Spinoza believed made human existence worth living: the peace that comes from genuine comprehension. So what does this mean for you, right now in your life with the beliefs you carry? It means that the first and most important task available to you is not to pray harder or believe more deeply or find a better church or read a better scripture. It is to question, to ask with genuine honesty whether what you believe about God and about your own existence is actually supported by anything other than the fact that you were taught it. This is not an attack on faith. This is not an argument that religious people are stupid or weak. This is simply an observation that Spinoza made, and that holds true regardless of your beliefs. Most people have never examined their foundational assumptions. Most people have never sat alone with the question of why they believe what they believe about God, and followed that question to its logical end. And the reason most people have never done this is not laziness. It is fear. Fear of what they might find. Fear of the emptiness that might exist on the other side of certainty. Fear that if they stop believing, they will lose not just God, but meaning, purpose, community, and the sense that their life matters. Spinoza would tell you that this fear is itself a form of bondage, that the only way through it is not to avoid it but to face it directly, to walk into the uncertainty and discover what is actually there when you do. What is there, according to Spinoza, is not emptiness. It is not nihilism. It is not the cold indifference of a universe that does not care. What is there is understanding, a deeper, more honest, more complete understanding of what God is, what you are, and what your relationship to reality actually looks like when you strip away the comfortable myths and look at it with clear eyes. God did not create human beings because God wanted to. God did not create human beings because God needed to. God did not create human beings because they are special or chosen or destined for some sacred mission. God created human beings because human beings were inevitable. Because the nature of reality, the infinite, necessary, eternal substance that Spinoza called God, could not exist without eventually producing beings capable of thought, beings capable of understanding, beings capable of looking back at the whole and, in some small way, comprehending it. You are not a gift. You are a consequence. And that distinction, that single, brutal distinction, is the horrifying truth that Spinoza saw when he looked at creation without the filter of faith. But here is the part that most people miss. The part that transforms this truth from a devastating blow into something that might, with time and effort, become the foundation of a genuinely free life. The fact that you are a consequence rather than a gift does not make you less. It makes you something different. It makes you a piece of reality that has become aware of itself, a part of the infinite whole that has developed the capacity to understand what the whole is. And that capacity, that awareness, that ability to comprehend is not something God gave you from outside. It is something God is expressed through you. You are not looking at God from the outside. You are God looking at itself from the inside. And the question is no longer, why did God create me? The question becomes, what will I do with the understanding I have been given, not as a gift, but as an expression of what I am? Spinoza spent his life answering that question, not through grand declarations or prophetic visions, but through patient, disciplined, logical thought. He believed that the highest human activity was not worship, but understanding. Not obedience, but comprehension. Not submission to a will you cannot see, but engagement with a reality you can, through reason, begin to grasp. He called this engagement, this intellectual communion with the nature of things, the only real path to what he called blessedness. Not blessedness in the religious sense of salvation or eternal life, blessedness in the philosophical sense of a mind that has achieved clarity, a mind that is no longer driven by fear, by ignorance, by the desperate need to believe in something comforting. A mind that has looked at the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable, and found in that clarity itself a kind of peace. This is not an easy path. Spinoza knew that. He wrote about it with remarkable honesty in the final sections of his greatest work, the Ethics. He acknowledged that the road from bondage to freedom, from belief to understanding, is long, difficult, and often lonely. He acknowledged that most people will not take it, that the comfort of faith is too powerful, the fear of uncertainty too great, the social pressure to conform too strong. But he also wrote, in one of the most memorable lines in all of philosophy, that all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. He was not promising that the journey would be pleasant. He was promising that it would be honest. And for Spinoza, honesty, complete, unflinching, logical honesty about the nature of reality, was the only thing worth pursuing. So here is where we arrive. Here is where the thread pulls tight and the full weight of this idea settles into place. You are told a story about why you exist, a story about love, about choice, about divine intention, a story that made you feel safe, made your suffering meaningful, made your death bearable. Spinoza looked at that story, and through centuries of philosophical tradition and his own rigorous independent reasoning, demonstrated that it cannot hold. Not because it is cruel, not because it is pessimistic, but because it is logically inconsistent with the nature of an infinite God. An infinite being cannot choose. An infinite being cannot desire. An infinite being cannot love in the personal, relational sense that the story requires. Because all of those things imply limitation, and limitation is the one thing infinity cannot contain. What remains when you remove the story is not nothing. It is something harder to hold and harder to love at first. But it is real. It is the understanding that your existence is not a gift, but an inevitability. That God did not make you out of compassion, but out of necessity. That you are not separate from the divine, but are, in the deepest possible sense, a part of it. And that understanding, uncomfortable as it is, opens a door that faith, for all its warmth, keeps permanently closed. It opens the door to seeing things as they actually are, to knowing yourself not as a creature dependent on grace, but as a conscious expression of the very reality you once called God, to experiencing the world not through the lens of obedience and reward, but through the lens of comprehension and freedom. This is what Spinoza meant when he said that understanding God is the same as loving God. Not a love built on gratitude for a gift, a love built on recognition. The recognition that the boundary between you and the divine was never real, that it was always an illusion, a useful one perhaps for people who are not yet ready to see clearly, but an illusion nonetheless. The horrifying truth is not that God does not exist. The horrifying truth is that God exists in a way that makes every comfortable story about your relationship to God fundamentally wrong. God did not create you because God wanted you. God created you because you were necessary. And the difference between those two sentences is the difference between a life lived inside a beautiful dream and a life lived with open eyes. Spinoza did not end his philosophy with despair. Neither should you. The end of the comfortable story is not the end of meaning. It is the beginning of a different kind of meaning, one that does not depend on an authority above you, but on the understanding you build within yourself. One that does not require submission, but requires thought. One that does not promise salvation, but offers something Spinoza considered far more valuable: clarity. Clarity about what you are. Clarity about what the world is. Clarity about the relationship between the two, which is not the relationship of a child to a parent or a servant to a master, but the relationship of a wave to the ocean, distinct in form, inseparable in substance. You are not here because someone loved you into existence. You are here because existence itself, in its infinite unfolding, could not avoid producing you. And within that production, within this brief, conscious thinking window of time that you call your life, you have one extraordinary capacity that almost nothing else in the known universe possesses. You can understand why you are here, not through faith, not through revelation, through reason, through the slow, honest, difficult process of examining what is true rather than what is comfortable. That is not a small thing. That is, in Spinoza's view, the closest a human being can come to what he called God, not by worshipping God, but by doing what God, in its infinite nature, does, existing, understanding, and expressing. The horrifying truth that Spinoza revealed is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to free you from the bondage of beliefs you never chose, free you from the fear of a universe that does not operate the way you were taught, free you from the loneliness of believing that you must earn your place in a reality that in fact you already fully belong to. Understanding is not the same as believing. Believing is passive. It accepts what it is given. Understanding is active. It examines, questions, tests, and arrives at conclusions through its own effort. And the conclusions it arrives at may not feel as warm as the ones faith provides, but they are honest. And honesty, once you taste it, is something you cannot go back from. Spinoza spent his short life, he died at 42, building a philosophical system that was, at its core, an act of radical honesty. He did not set out to destroy religion, he set out to understand God. And the God he found was not the God of scripture or tradition or personal devotion. It was something far larger, far more indifferent to human concerns, and far more magnificent than any personal deity could ever be. It was the totality of existence itself, eternal, infinite, necessary, and utterly indifferent to whether you believe in it or not. That indifference is not cruelty. It is simply what infinity looks like when it has no capacity for personal preference. And within that indifference, human beings have carved out something extraordinary: the ability to understand, the ability to see, the ability to ask the questions that Spinoza spent his life asking, and to follow the answers wherever they lead. The horrifying truth is this: you were not made for a reason. You were made because making was inevitable. But the extraordinary truth, the one that lives right beside the horror, inseparable from it, is this: you are the universe knowing itself, and that knowledge, incomplete as it always will be, is the closest thing to meaning that existence has to offer. Not given, earned, through thought, through honesty, through the courage to look at what is true and choose understanding over comfort. That is Spinoza's legacy, not a religion, not a system of worship, not a set of rules for how to live, a method, a way of looking at the world that demands nothing from you except your willingness to think, really think, about what you believe and why you believe it. He would not ask you to accept his conclusions on faith. That would contradict everything he stood for. He would ask you to examine them, to test them against your own reason, to sit with them, the discomfort and all, and see whether they hold up under honest scrutiny. And if they do, if you find, through your own careful thought, that the story you were told about God and creation and human purpose does not survive contact with logic, then you face a choice, not between belief and atheism, not between faith and despair, between comfort and clarity, between the dream and the open eyes. Spinoza chose clarity. It cost him everything: his community, his reputation, his safety. But it gave him something that no amount of faith ever could: the peace of a mind that has seen the truth and made peace with it. That peace is available to you too, not as a gift, as a possibility, one that opens only when you are willing to ask the questions that most people spend their lives avoiding. So ask them. Start with the simplest one, the one that Spinoza himself would have placed first. Why do you believe what you believe about God? Not what were you taught, not what feels right, not what everyone around you believes. Why do you, as an individual capable of thought, accept this particular version of reality as true? If you have an honest answer, an answer built on evidence and reason rather than tradition and comfort, then hold it, examine it, strengthen it or let it fall apart, whichever is what honesty demands. And if you do not have an honest answer, if you find when you look closely that your beliefs about God and creation and human purpose are simply things you inherited without ever choosing them, then you are standing at the same door Spinoza stood at over 3 centuries ago, the door to understanding. It is not an easy door to walk through. Everything on the other side looks different from what you were promised, but it is real, and once you step through it, you cannot step back. All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. That was Spinoza's final word on the matter, not a promise of salvation, not a guarantee of happiness, a statement of fact about the relationship between truth and effort. The things worth having, the things that actually set your mind free, are not the things that come easily. They are the things that require you to be brave enough to question everything you thought you knew. God did not create you because God wanted you. God created you because you were the only possible outcome of what God is. And what you do with that knowledge, whether you run from it or sit with it, whether you let it destroy you or let it teach you, that is the one choice in your existence that is genuinely, entirely yours. This is not the end of the conversation. This is the beginning. If what you have heard today has stirred something in you, a question, a doubt, an uncomfortable recognition, then that stirring is worth paying attention to. Doubt is not the enemy of understanding. It is the doorway to it. Every philosopher who ever advanced human knowledge began not with certainty, but with the willingness to be uncertain. Spinoza began there. And from that beginning, he built one of the most complete and honest pictures of reality that any human mind has ever produced. You do not have to agree with him. You do not have to accept his conclusions. You only have to be willing to think, genuinely, honestly, without the safety net of what you were told, about the questions he spent his life asking. If you are willing to do that, then share your thoughts. Write what this provoked in you. Agree, disagree, challenge, or add to what was presented here. The conversation about God, about existence, and about why we are here is not owned by any religion, any institution, or any single philosopher. It belongs to every mind willing to engage with it. And if you want to continue, if you want to go deeper into Spinoza, into the nature of God, into the questions that most people never ask because they are too afraid of the answers, then stay, subscribe, follow along, because this is only the beginning of a much larger exploration. One that will take us into places that are uncomfortable, fascinating, and, if Spinoza was right, ultimately liberating. The truth is not always what we want it to be, but it is always what we need.